Long before I ever had words for fear, I believed terror was something you could turn off with a nightlight. I was wrong. What happened that August in Ravenswood when I was 11 proved that fear lives on the inside, patient, invisible, and permanent. I can still smell the cedar siding of our house and the damp bite of late summer fog as if it's happening this very minute. That night carved a line through my childhood like a scar. Ravenswood was the sort of town where people measured time by the arrival of rain. My father liked to joke that we had only 2 seasons, rain and waiting for rain. By late August, the fog clung to the pines like wet wool. Our neighborhood sat at the edge of a forest that seemed to breathe when the temperature dropped. Even in daylight, the pines whispered and creaked, their tops lost in mist. At night, the woods turned into a darker sky below the real one. For weeks, I had begged to host a backyard campout. My 3 best friends, Leo, Finn, and Owen, agreed without hesitation. Leo was the loud one, all elbows and jokes. Finn was the skeptic, never impressed by campfire stories. Owen barely spoke, but when he did, we listened. Dad helped us pitch the big canvas tent, driving each stake deep into the damp ground. He hung a single yellow lantern from the porch that glowed like a ship's light in gray water. Mom brought out a plate of hot dogs, the steam curling upward before the fog swallowed it. We roasted marshmallows on wire hangers until the sugar blistered and blackened, then blew out the flames and laughed through sticky teeth. The fog thickened until the back fence became only a charcoal outline. The woods beyond that fence had always fascinated and unnerved me. Pines rose like cathedral pillars and their roots crawled like sleeping animals across the forest floor. We dared each other to touch the fence, to whisper the old story of a logger who'd vanished out there without a trace. It felt like a game, the kind that feeds on half-believed legends. I reached for another marshmallow, and that's when I saw it, a tall silhouette by the compost heap, thin as a splinter and perfectly still. "Neighbor's dog," Finn said without even looking up. But dogs don't stand upright. The figure was too tall, too narrow. The fog shifted and the shape seemed to lean just slightly, as if the mist itself had learned to breathe. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice small. Leo squinted. "Probably a branch. Wind makes things look weird." The branch, if it was one, didn't move when the wind stirred. My skin prickled. I told myself to look away. Dad stepped outside to collect the empty plate, and the figure vanished, swallowed by the fog like it had never been there. By midnight, the lantern dimmed to an amber ember and our laughter thinned into yawns. We zipped the tent closed, our sleeping bags a patchwork of reds and blues. Somewhere a night bird called once, then silence swallowed it whole. Leo's voice came from the dark. "You guys think that was really a branch?" "Obviously," Finn whispered. "What else? A ghost?" No one laughed. The air inside the tent grew heavier. Owen rolled onto his side, facing the door. I could barely hear his breathing. That's when the rasp began. Fabric on fabric, soft at first, then unmistakable. A sound like someone dragging a fingernail down canvas. Zip-zip. The tent's entrance flap quivered. "What's that?" Owen's whisper trembled. The zipper slid upward, a slow metallic scrape. Before I could speak, a hand, icy, rough, calloused, latched around my ankle. I screamed, a sound that cracked my throat and kicked with every ounce of terror my small body owned. The grip slipped. "Run!" I shrieked. We exploded from the tent, barefoot, hearts hammering like fists on a door. Gravel bit into my feet as we tore across the yard. The porch light blazed ahead like salvation. Dad burst through the back door, baseball bat in hand, his face sharpened by panic. "What happened?" "There's someone. Someone in the yard," I gasped. But the yard lay empty except for the trembling tent and the fog swirling like smoke around the cedar posts. Mom followed, her robe cinched tight. "Are you hurt?" She pulled me into her arms, my breath still ragged. Dad strode toward the fence, bat raised, scanning the gray wall beyond. He found nothing. No footprints in the damp grass, no sign of movement except the slow drift of fog. We searched together, flashlights cutting narrow tunnels through the mist. The woods stood silent, holding their secrets. Dad finally herded us inside, locking the door behind us with a click that sounded too small to keep anything out. The police arrived 20 minutes later, 2 patrol cars, headlights slicing the fog like search beams. Red and blue strobes washed across the cedar siding, while a German shepherd strained at its leash. Officer Martinez, broad-shouldered and calm, questioned Dad while his partner swept a flashlight across the yard. "Any sign of forced entry?" Martinez asked. Dad shook his head. "They came from the woods. My son says someone grabbed him through the tent." I hugged my knees on the porch steps, still shivering. Leo, Finn, and Owen sat beside me like statues, their usual chatter locked behind pale faces. The dog led them to the back fence and pressed its nose against the gate, tail stiff. The officers unlatched it and disappeared into the forest. For long minutes, we heard only the crunch of boots and the dog's low whine. Then a shout, "Over here!" We hurried to the fence. Martinez crouched beside a patch of wet earth where a single muddy boot print sank deep among the pine needles. It faced away from the house, toes pointing toward the dark. "Big foot for a kid," he muttered. He followed a faint trail of snapped twigs until the path vanished into a tangle of ferns. "Could be a hunter, maybe a drifter," the other officer said, but his voice lacked conviction. Back at the porch, Mom wrapped a blanket around my shoulders. Her hand trembled against my hair. "It's over now," she whispered. But even as she said it, the forest stood there, silent, watching. The police stayed for over an hour, sweeping the perimeter with flashlights and the dog's sharp nose. Nothing else turned up. No one had seen a stranger in the neighborhood, no vehicles had passed the quiet street. Finally, Martinez left his card on the porch rail. "Call if you notice anything unusual. Keep the doors locked." For the next few nights, Dad left the porch, light burning like a second moon. The tent lay collapsed on the lawn, damp and silent. We pretended to sleep, every creak of the house a whispered warning. At school, Finn tried to joke it away. Probably some raccoon with a cold hand. But even he refused to stay after dark when we rode bikes. Leo swore he saw a flicker of movement in the trees on his way home, a glint of something metallic in the underbrush. 3 days later, hikers found something deep in the pines, a crude lean-to built from fallen branches and torn tarps. Inside hung 3 children's sneakers, all mismatched, dangling like trophies. No one was ever caught. Time moved forward the way water slips around a rock, steadily, but never erasing what's buried beneath. We grew older, voices deepened, bikes became cars. Yet that night lived under my skin like a splinter I couldn't dig out. I avoided sleepovers, especially outdoors. Even the smell of damp cedar sent a nervous current down my spine. I learned to smile when people teased me for keeping the porch light on. When I left Ravenswood for college, the memory came with me like a packed bag I couldn't leave behind. I studied criminology, maybe hoping to give shape to the faceless thing that had reached for me. But every case file, every fingerprint card, reminded me how easily a person can vanish without leaving enough evidence to name. Leo drifted to a music school in Seattle, Finn became a mechanical engineer, Owen joined the Coast Guard. We kept in touch, but whenever we met, that night hovered unspoken between us. A glance, a half smile, and we all knew. During late-night study sessions, I sometimes caught the sound of canvas rasping in my memory, the slow metallic slide of a zipper. I'd jolt awake certain someone stood at the foot of my bed. Fear, I learned, is not a single moment. It is a companion. It travels quietly, changing shape, but it never truly leaves. Years later, I returned to Ravenswood for a long weekend. My parents had added a new deck and a higher fence. The pines had thinned. Yet on quiet nights, the breeze sighed through the needles in a voice I would never mistake. Dad grilled salmon while Mom set out lemonade. We talked about work, about my move to Portland, about ordinary things. But when dusk rolled in and the fog gathered, the old memory rose like a tide. After dinner, I walked to the back fence alone. The air smelled of damp earth and cedar. The woods were smaller now, yet the shadows between trunks still held their own darkness. I closed my eyes and listened. No rasp of canvas, no zipper, only the slow, patient breathing of the forest. I tell the story sometimes, not as a ghost tale, but as a warning. We like to believe danger announces itself, that evil wears a mask or carries a sign. It doesn't. It waits in the ordinary, behind a fence, inside a fog, in the silence between crickets. The moral isn't that we should live in fear, but that we should never be careless with our trust. Lock the doors. Listen to your instincts. Teach children that caution isn't cowardice, because the most frightening monsters are rarely the ones we imagine. They are the ones we almost didn't see. Long before that night, I had imagined summer as endless golden afternoons, the kind where time stretched like sunlight on the hills. Turning 14 that June, I felt taller, older somehow, and capable of adventures my parents might frown upon. When they sent me to spend 2 weeks with my cousin Maya at her family's farmhouse on the edge of Dorset's chalk hills, I pictured a pastoral dream. Fields painted with wildflowers, the distant bleat of sheep, and nights so quiet, the stars themselves seemed to whisper. I had never been away from home alone, and the thrill of independence carried me like a tide. Maya met me at the farmhouse door with a mischievous grin, her braid swinging over her shoulder. She was 2 years older, the kind of girl who could turn even cleaning the barn into a secret mission. The farmhouse itself had the kind of charm only years of patchwork repairs can give: sun-faded shutters, a low stone wall curling around the yard, and a barn that seemed to lean slightly, like it had been listening to the wind for generations. That first evening, the sun dipped behind the chalk hills, spilling amber over the gravel lane, and the air smelled of hay, grass, and the faint tang of rain yet to fall. We dragged our sleeping bags up to the hayloft, our laughter echoing off the timber. A bat flickered past the open door and disappeared into the darkness. The straw smelled sweet and dry under our hands. Maya's grandfather appeared at the bottom of the ladder, his lined face catching the fading light. "Bolt the loft door," he warned, his voice low. "Poachers prowl after dark. Don't tempt trouble." We nodded, full of teenage bravado, and promised to obey. But once he left, the summer breeze calling through the loft made us curious. The door stayed half-latched. We whispered about constellations and ghosts, imagining stories behind each star. Somewhere in the distance, the hoot of an owl punctuated our giggles. I felt safe, wrapped in the straw and the familiar presence of Maya. The night was perfect, until it wasn't. It started with a metallic clang. My eyes snapped open to darkness so complete it pressed against my skin. From below, a heavy scrape reverberated through the barn, boots on gravel, slow and deliberate. My pulse hammered in my ears. "Maya," I whispered, nudging her. She groaned, half asleep. "It's just the wind," she muttered, but wind does not drag sacks. A faint glow flickered beneath the boards, a lantern swinging like a heartbeat in the shadows. I leaned closer to the crack in the floorboards and saw it. A hooded figure dragging a large sack that twitched as though alive. The sight froze me, a cold weight settling in my stomach. We scrambled toward the ladder, thinking we could escape quietly, but it was already lowered. Whoever it was had climbed halfway up before we even knew. My hands shook as I yanked the loft door shut. I rammed a pitchfork through the latch just as the ladder creaked under a single, deliberate step. The humming stopped. Silence pressed in thicker than the straw dust. "Call the police," I whispered. My fingers fumbled for my phone. Maya shook her head, eyes wide. "We need to stay quiet. He'll hear us." Minutes stretched, every second an eternity. Then a shadow fell across the loft floor. The latch rattled as someone tried to force it. I braced myself, heart hammering, fingers tightening on the pitchfork. The intruder hesitated, then retreated. Downstairs, the faint sound of footsteps receded. By dawn, the police arrived. The scene was strangely empty. only the rope ladder swaying in the morning breeze and a sack of animal pelts left behind. No sign of the intruder himself. Clara, I kept thinking of myself as brave, but that night had changed me. I never again mistook the creak of a single rung for the wind. The stars, once comforting, now felt like silent witnesses to something I could never unsee. The morning sun felt harsh, almost accusing when I climbed down from the loft. Maya's grandfather had returned, his expression unreadable. The barn smelled faintly of hay and something sour, a reminder of the previous night's terror. I kept glancing at the swaying rope ladder, my stomach twisting every time it moved with the breeze. "Did you lock the door properly?" he asked, voice quiet but firm. I hesitated, then shook my head. It was half-latched, I admitted, and the weight of that choice hit me suddenly. Maya's grandfather sighed and placed a hand on my shoulder. "Curiosity and carelessness," he said softly. "They often lead to trouble." I wanted to argue, to say we were careful, but my voice caught. He looked past me toward the field where the intruder had vanished. "Sometimes the world reminds us it isn't ours to control," he added. We spent the day inspecting the barn. The sacks of animal pelts had been left behind, but nothing else. The police asked questions, scribbled notes, and left with promises to patrol the area. But the emptiness in the barn, the lingering scent, was proof that someone had been there, and that we had been lucky. Maya and I didn't speak much that day. Our adventure had shifted from a summer thrill to a shadow we could neither shake nor name. That evening we returned to the hayloft. I felt uneasy, my eyes scanning every corner. "Do you think he'll come back?" I asked. Maya hugged her knees, voice barely a whisper. "I hope not, but even if he does, we'll be ready." The bravado sounded hollow even to me. As night fell again, the wind whispered through the loft. The sound no longer seemed comforting. It was a reminder of choices, of doors left unlatched, of the fragility of safety. I tried to sleep, but every creak and sigh of the barn kept me on edge. The hum of last night's intruder echoed in my mind, and I realized how easily fear could shape a person. By the third night, our caution had grown. We double-bolted the loft door, wedged the ladder securely, and even tied a length of rope from the loft to the barn beam so we'd hear if anyone tried to climb. Yet the real change wasn't in the locks or ropes, it was in us. I found myself noticing small details. The way shadows pooled under the eaves, the flicker of moonlight on a stray branch, the way gravel shifted even without footsteps. Every sound was a question mark. Sleep became a fragile state, punctuated by jumps and whispers. Maya and I no longer joked about ghosts or shadows. The air itself seemed heavier, charged with possibility. One night, as a storm rolled in, we heard a rustling outside. Not heavy boots this time, but smaller, deliberate movements. My heart raced, but I forced myself to remain still, gripping the rope that would alert us if anyone tried to climb. The storm made everything louder. The clatter of rain, the rattle of shutters, the whine of wind through the barn beams. And then it stopped. Silence. We waited until dawn, adrenaline fading into exhaustion. When we finally opened the door, the field was empty. Not a trace of the rustling, not a mark, nothing. It was as if the world had pressed pause, giving us a lesson in patience, observation, and humility. The thrill of adventure was real, but the lesson was heavier. Respect for the unknown, respect for consequences, and respect for safety. Our final morning at the farmhouse was quiet. The sky glowed with the soft promise of summer, the fields a patchwork of green and gold. Maya and I packed our bags in silence, carrying the weight of what had happened, but also a strange pride. We had faced fear without panicking, learned vigilance, and discovered that courage isn't loud. It's careful, measured, and steady. As we walked down the gravel lane toward our parents' car, Maya glanced back at the barn. "We'll never forget this place," she said. I nodded, a lump in my throat. I knew I never would. On the drive home, I reflected on those nights. Fear is a teacher. It shows you where you are careless, where you are brave, and where you are unprepared. It reminds you that the world contains more than we can control, and that respect for rules, for warnings, and for safety matters more than pride or curiosity. That summer, I had imagined adventure as endless golden afternoons. But adventure had its price, and I had learned it firsthand. The moral, I realized, was simple. Bravery is not the absence of fear. It is understanding it, respecting it, and acting wisely despite it. Doors left half-latched, choices made lightly, or rules ignored can lead to consequences we never imagined. And sometimes, the quietest lessons, the ones whispered by the night, stay with us the longest. I never thought a simple study session could turn into the kind of night that stays with you forever. It all began one gray November morning, when Lydia, my closest friend since middle school, called me in a rush. She lived in a sprawling villa perched on the cliffs above Monterey, where the ocean roared so loudly that even during calm weather, the wind carried the smell of salt into the halls. "I know it's last minute," Lydia said, her voice almost bouncing off the phone line. "But my parents are out this weekend and I have a ton of homework for chemistry and English. You should come. It'll be fun, like a sleepover with a view of the storm." It sounded innocent enough. At 16, sleepovers weren't unusual, and the thought of being alone in a massive cliffside house with someone I trusted seemed thrilling, if a little dramatic. I agreed. The drive up the coastal road was a mess. Rain swept across the highway, blurring headlights into smeared lines. By the time I arrived, the villa was glowing behind storm-tossed trees like a lighthouse caught in a tempest. Lydia met me at the door, hair damp and cheeks pink from the cold. She waved me inside, calling, "You're just in time. The storm's starting." Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedar and lavender. Massive windows framed sheets of rain and crashing waves. We dumped our bags in the guest room and moved to the living room, spreading notebooks across the floor. Music hummed from a small speaker, and candles flickered on the mantel, though the storm made even the softest lighting seem dramatic. The wind picked up, rattling the windows, and the lights flickered. "Just the storm," Lydia said with a shrug. I tried to agree, though my stomach clenched. We worked in silence for a while, taking turns reading paragraphs aloud. The sound of the surf, normally comforting, started to feel like it was pressing against the glass, testing our solitude. Around 10:30, a dull thunk at the sliding glass door made me glance up. I saw nothing. The rain was falling too hard to make out details, just sheets of water streaking the glass. I shrugged it off. The second tap, sharper, like knuckles against wood, froze me. My heart thudded, and I whispered, "Did you hear that?" Lydia muted the music. "It's the wind," she said, but her voice was tighter than usual. Even as we convinced ourselves, the storm seemed to grow louder, and the familiar hum of the ocean became something darker. Then the porch light snapped on, a motion sensor, and there it was. A shadow pressed flat against the glass, unmoving, hood over the head, face hidden. Rain streaked down the figure like water sliding over black stone. My fingers tightened around my phone. Before I could react, the light went out. In the dim glow of the storm, letters appeared, smeared across the condensation. "I see you." We didn't speak. We didn't move. Instinct took over. Lydia and I shoved the sofa against the sliding door, its heavy weight rattling across the tile floor. I dialed 911 with trembling fingers. The operator's voice was calm, almost impossibly calm, and I had to repeat my address twice because the storm made the words stick in my throat. I kept glancing at the window. Nothing. The glass was smooth, apart from the wet smear of our fingerprints. The rain hammered against the roof, against the walls, as if the house itself were alive and angry. "Did it disappear?" Lydia whispered. I couldn't answer. My eyes caught movement, tiny at first, along the hallway window upstairs. The latch was undone. The wind swung the window back and forth, a hollow whine accompanying the metal screech. We ran upstairs, the wooden floorboards groaning beneath us. My pulse was a drum, my breath sharp in my ears. I couldn't imagine how anyone could have gotten in, or out, without leaving obvious signs. The footprints in the mud outside the sliding doors made no sense. They ended at the cliff, where there should have been a fall, a slide, a splash. But there was nothing. The operator's voice came through again. "Help is on the way, stay calm." I wanted to argue that calm was impossible. The storm had a weight, a presence that filled every corner of the house. It wasn't just wind and rain. It felt as though something else was there with us, waiting. Minutes dragged. We stayed by the barricade, whispering, listening to every creak, every hollow thump. Occasionally, the rain would pause, just enough for me to hear the faint scratching of glass, letters forming, then disappearing. I didn't dare read them. When the police finally arrived, muddy shoes crunching on the tile, they found nothing. The footprints stopped at the cliff edge, just shy of disaster. No slide, no fall, nothing to indicate how a person could vanish into the stormy night. I lay awake in the guest room that night, the storm thrashing against the windows, replaying the face in the hood and the letters scrawled in condensation. For years, whenever a winter storm rattled the windows, I could see those words. "I see you." They haunted me. A whisper from the cliffs, a reminder that the world sometimes holds more than we're ready to understand. It took months before I could even drive past the Monterey Cliffs without my hands tightening on the steering wheel. Every winter storm reminded me of that night, the pounding rain, the gusts that seemed almost intelligent in their fury, and the faint, unforgettable words etched in condensation. "I see you." Lydia and I stopped speaking about it at first. Not out of fear exactly, but because talking felt like summoning it back into existence. Eventually, life resumed. High school, part-time jobs, homework. But the memory was always there, a low hum beneath everything else. One evening, a year later, Lydia called me. Her voice was nervous. "Harper, I don't know what to say. The house, we got a weird letter. It's the same handwriting, same style in condensation, but this time, inside my room." My stomach dropped. I hadn't expected it to reach us again. She described the message exactly as I had feared, the words scrawled across her bedroom mirror, barely legible but unmistakable. "I locked the doors, Harper. I don't get it. I didn't see anyone, nobody was there, but the letters, they're just there." We decided together to return, this time during daylight, cautiously. My parents insisted on coming along, which helped, though they didn't quite understand the gravity. The villa seemed smaller in the light of day, less threatening, but the air smelled of salt and rain like it had that first night. The letters on the mirror had vanished. The police said it could have been condensation, fingerprints, something harmless. But Lydia and I exchanged a glance that said otherwise. Something had been inside that house, and it hadn't needed doors. Months passed, but unease grew. I found myself avoiding rainstorms, avoiding windows at night. Every shadow seemed heavier. Every knock, no matter how faint, sent my pulse racing. Finally, driven by curiosity and a need for closure, Lydia and I returned in early winter. This time we carried flashlights, cameras, and a sense of determination. We scoured every inch of the house. The sliding doors were secured, the windows latched, yet the mud outside told a story that made no sense. Footprints ended mid-cliff, a puzzle that defied logic. "Maybe it's someone watching from the rocks," Lydia suggested, though even she sounded doubtful. I frowned. The mud ends on solid ground. The cliff drops straight to the surf. There's no way a person could vanish without leaving a trace. We spent hours photographing footprints, analyzing water patterns, trying to find an explanation grounded in reality. We didn't find one. The storm seemed to have erased evidence with the meticulousness of a professional, leaving only fear behind. That night, as we left, a gust of wind caught the corner of the villa. Something whispered along the siding, almost human, almost intentional. Lydia gripped my arm. "It's like it knows we're here." I nodded silently, a chill crawling up my spine. Whatever it was, human, animal, or something else, it had claimed a corner of that cliff for itself, a private theater where we were mere spectators. Years later, I can look back at that night and understand something crucial. Fear is often as much about perception as reality. The shadow in the hood, the letters, the footprints, they forced me to confront my vulnerability, my tendency to trust what seems solid when the world is in fact unpredictable. I learned to respect boundaries, both human and natural. I learned caution, not paranoia. And I learned that some mysteries may never be solved, but that doesn't mean you can't live fully despite them. Lydia and I eventually moved on, though we never forgot. The villa was sold, storms still came, and when the wind whistled across the Monterey cliffs, I could almost feel that same presence, a reminder that the world is wider and stranger than we often admit. The moral, I realized, is this: fear has power only when you let it control you. Confront it, respect it, and you gain insight, not just terror. Some nights will always be dark and storm-lashed, but the human spirit, cautious, curious, and resilient, can endure them and even learn from them. I still remember that first tap at the door, the flash of the motion sensor, and the words that made my blood run cold. And I smile because fear didn't break me, it taught me. I never thought a simple weekend getaway could turn into a memory that would haunt me for years, but that's exactly what happened. It began with Miles, my closest friend since middle school, calling me on a Thursday afternoon. "Rowan, my parents are away, and we've got the lodge to ourselves," he said, excitement in his voice that I couldn't resist. The Black Forest was more remote than I'd ever been, and the thought of a winter weekend in a timber-framed lodge, miles from the nearest neighbor, felt like stepping into another world. I arrived late Friday afternoon, snow already beginning to fall. The lodge was rustic but warm, with exposed beams and a roaring fireplace that seemed to promise endless nights of movies, snacks, and teenage laughter. Miles' parents had left instructions to respect the caretaker's property, and that was fine with me. I was more than happy to disappear into this little snow-covered retreat. We spent the first few hours settling in. Miles set up the movie projector while I gathered extra firewood. Outside, the wind began to howl, rattling the window panes, and I remember thinking how perfect the isolation felt. Or at least I thought it was perfect until the power went out. One moment the projector was humming. The next, the entire house fell silent except for the wind thrashing against the walls. Miles groaned. "Great. Of course, it goes out now." I grabbed a flashlight, trying to laugh it off, but the storm had taken over completely. Snow piled against the doors and windows, creating a kind of eerie cocoon. I volunteered to fetch more firewood from the shed. The cold was immediate, biting through my jacket. As I approached the tree line, I froze. There, in the fresh snow, were two footprints, small, deliberate, and unnervingly precise. They started at the edge of the forest and ended at the lodge with no trail leading back. My heartbeat accelerated. "Miles!" I called, voice cracking more than I intended. He came out, peering over my shoulder. "That's weird," he said, frowning. The front door was locked when I checked. I wanted to laugh, wanted to tell myself it was an animal or some trick of the storm. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. These were human footprints, and they weren't supposed to be there. After barricading the front door again, we tried to shake off the unease. Miles insisted we stay downstairs close to the fire, but curiosity and a creeping sense of dread made me restless. That's when I heard it, a sharp rap on the second-floor balcony. I froze. "What was that?" Miles whispered. His eyes were wide, reflecting the flickering firelight. Before I could answer, a whistle rose from the balcony, long and low, winding up and down like someone trying to mimic the wind itself. The hair on my neck stood on end. We grabbed lanterns and crept upstairs. every creak of the floorboards underfoot echoing like a gunshot in the storm-silenced house. The balcony doors were open, swinging slightly in the wind. Snow had drifted inside, powdery and cold. There were footprints here too, but smaller, childlike, leading to the edge of the railing. I leaned over, looking down into the clearing below, but the forest was still, empty, and silent. My breath came in visible puffs, my hands shaking as I gripped the lantern. Then it came again, the whistle, this time from downstairs. We looked at each other, frozen. My rational mind searched for explanations, an animal, a trick of the wind. But Miles and I both knew this was something different. We didn't sleep that night. We stayed huddled near the fire, taking turns watching the shadows outside the windows. Every sound made us jump, the creak of a branch, the howl of wind, the distant groan of old timber. By morning, exhaustion had dulled our fear, replaced with a silent dread that refused to leave. When the caretaker arrived, he found us pale and trembling. We told him everything, the footprints, the whistle, the open balcony. He listened, said nothing for a long moment, then handed us a single paper crane pinned to the inside of the front door with an antique ice pick. It was the last thing I saw before leaving the lodge that morning, the crane fluttering slightly in the wind. Even now, years later, I can close my eyes and hear that whistle, feel the snow under my boots, and wonder who or what had walked those one-way paths in the snows. The rest of that day passed in a haze of fear and half-sleep. Miles and I tried to distract ourselves, stacking firewood and attempting small talk, but every time the wind rattled the windows, every time the snow scraped against the walls, I felt eyes on us. By late afternoon, I convinced myself that exhaustion had twisted my mind. Maybe it had. I decided to check the perimeter of the lodge, just to confirm no one or nothing was lurking nearby. The snow was deep now, rising past my knees in places, and the storm had turned the forest into a white blur. That's when I noticed it again. Another set of footprints, this time beginning at the lodge's side door and vanishing into the forest. Only one set, small and delicate. "Rowan, you're imagining things," Miles said behind me. But he sounded less certain than usual, and I could see his gaze following the snow beyond the trees. We followed the prints for a few yards, our boots crunching in the snow, but they ended abruptly in a hollow where the snow had drifted thick. Nothing. No signs of struggle, no tracks leading back, just emptiness. My stomach sank. We returned inside, closing the door carefully behind us. Miles sat near the fire, rubbing his hands together, trying to look calm. "Do you think someone's playing a joke?" he asked, his voice low. I shook my head. Whoever, or whatever, had been here wasn't joking. I'd never seen anything like those prints in my life. Night fell again. The wind picked up, and once more the whistle came. This time, it circled the house, moving from one side to another, rising and falling like it was following us. Miles and I didn't speak. We just huddled in the living room, clutching lanterns, listening to it, each note pressing into our ears like ice. I kept thinking about the paper crane. Who had left it? Why? My rational mind failed to produce an answer. Something told me it was meant to be noticed, a signal rather than a threat. But if that was true, the intent was inscrutable, eerie in its silence. Hours later, I dozed briefly, only to wake at the sound of footsteps on the stairs. Heavy, deliberate, but not ours. Miles was awake too, pale and rigid. We stayed silent, waiting, heartbeats echoing in the vast lodge. The steps stopped outside our door, a soft scrape of wood, then nothing. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving a crystalline calm. The footprints outside were gone, as if erased by the snow or by some unseen hand. I thought relief would come with daylight, but it didn't. It only left questions. When the caretaker arrived, his expression was grave but calm. He examined the lodge carefully, noting nothing unusual apart from the paper crane pinned to the door. "This sometimes happens," he said quietly, more to himself than to us. "A visitor, long forgotten. You didn't see it. You didn't hear it." "What do you mean?" I asked, heart pounding. He gestured to the old photographs lining the main hallway, black and white portraits of children who had lived in the lodge decades ago. Some were smiling, others solemn. "Some spirits linger," he said, almost as an afterthought. "They're not harmful usually, just curious, just lonely." The idea didn't make me feel safer. Yet, as we left the lodge, I looked at the forest, the frost sparkling on every branch, and I realized something profound. The footprints, the whistle, even the paper crane, all of it was a message, a reminder of presence, of life that had once been here, long before we arrived. Back in the car, Miles broke the silence. "Do you think it wanted us to see it?" he asked, voice low. I nodded. Somehow I knew it had. And in that strange understanding, a flicker of peace replaced fear. Even now, years later, the memory of that weekend lives vividly in my mind. I can still hear the whistle curling around the lodge, feel the crunch of snow under boots, the sudden terror of a sound that shouldn't exist. But I also remember the crane, perfectly folded, pinned to the door. A symbol not of menace but of acknowledgement, of life lingering beyond the visible. I've learned to live with uncertainty, to accept that not everything can be explained. Fear often comes from what we cannot understand, but sometimes wonder and respect comes from the same source. That weekend taught me more than courage. It taught me humility, patience, and the quiet power of observation. Not every mystery needs solving. Some are simply reminders of fragility, of connection, of the unseen lives intertwined with our own. I carry it with me. The forest, the snow, the whistle, they are echoes in my memory. Every winter wind I hear brings a shiver, not just of fear, but of reverence. And whenever I fold a paper crane, I remember that some messages are meant to be received quietly, not dissected or rationalized. The moral is simple. Not every presence is meant to harm. Not every mystery is meant to frighten. Sometimes we only need to witness, to respect, and to remember. Life, seen or unseen, leaves traces. And it is in noticing those traces that we find humility, empathy, and a strange, beautiful awe. I had always loved the idea of winter, the kind where snow smothered everything in quiet, blanketing the world in soft white, as if time itself had taken a nap. So when Greta invited me to spend a week at her parents' ski chalet above Lake Lucerne during winter break, I didn't hesitate. At 15, a sleepover in a secluded chalet sounded like freedom wrapped in snowflakes. Greta's parents had been wintering elsewhere, leaving the cabin to echo with our laughter and the hum of our adolescent mischief. The drive up the winding mountain road was a frozen dream, headlights catching flakes that seemed to linger like suspended diamonds in the air. By the time we arrived, the chalet stood stark against the pale moonlight, all timber and stone, smoke curling lazily from the chimney. Greta grinned, her breath fogging in the frigid air. "It's perfect," she whispered. "No neighbors, no noise, just us." We settled in quickly. Greta's room became the command center, with blankets piled like a fort and candles flickering in the corners, casting shadows that danced on the walls. The first evening was easy, filled with stories, hot chocolate, and silly dares. I felt a warm buzz of security, lulled by the illusion that we were alone. That illusion shattered the moment the lights flickered. The boiler coughed, a harsh metallic groan, and then everything went black. Silence. The wind picked up, hissing through the cracks of the chalet's wooden frame, and the warmth that had hugged us evaporated in a heartbeat. I lit candles while Greta scrambled for extra blankets. "Probably just a fuse," she said, but her voice had that edge of tension I hadn't heard before. It wasn't the blackout that terrified us. It was the sound that came afterward, the long, whining squeal of metal from the far end of the balcony. My heart stuttered. "What was that?" I asked. Greta shrugged, but neither of us moved closer. Then she finally said, "We should check. Maybe an animal?" We stepped outside cautiously, boots crunching in the fresh snow. And then we saw it. A single boot print, heavy and deliberate, toes pointed toward the chalet door. My stomach lurched. Greta's hand shot to the doorknob, fumbling with her key. But it turned beneath her fingers, smooth and cold, as if unlocked by an unseen hand. A breath fogged the outer glass pane, slow and deliberate. We froze. One exhale, and then nothing. No movement, no shadow, just the empty glass reflecting our pale faces. Panic rose in my throat, but Greta's instinct was faster. She slammed the shutters and grabbed the phone, dialing the mountain patrol. Static hissed through the receiver before a low male voice cut through. "You can lock every door but one." We ran from room to room, every corner and hallway checked, hearts hammering in unison. That's when I saw the loft hatch, slightly ajar, snow melting on the ladder rungs as if someone had climbed down recently. Neither of us wanted to go up, but the dread in Greta's eyes mirrored my own. We huddled in the living room listening, the chalet suddenly too big, too hollow. By the time the patrol arrived at dawn, only one thing marked the night: the single boot print circling the chalet like it had been pacing in some deliberate rhythm. Even now, years later, I can't hear the soft creak of snow on a roof without shivering. That quiet, that fleeting exhale behind my shoulder. It never really leaves you. The morning after the patrol left, the snow outside the chalet glittered under the pale sun, untouched except for the spiraling boot print that had circled the building the night before. Greta and I sat in the living room, huddled in blankets, neither of us speaking. The silence was heavier than the snowdrifts outside, as if the chalet itself remembered the terror it had witnessed. I wanted to tell someone, anyone, but the words felt hollow. How could I explain an invisible presence, a breath on the glass, a door that unlocked itself? The authorities had shrugged it off politely, offering explanations like wandering hikers or shifting roof snow. But deep down, I knew better. We spent the day cautiously inspecting the chalet. Doors, windows, every hatch and nook. Everything seemed untouched, immaculate even. Yet the loft hatch drew my eyes again. Snow had melted in small rivulets along the ladder rungs, glistening like tears in the pale morning light. Greta, what if it wasn't just someone outside? I asked quietly. She didn't answer right away, instead tracing the boot print in the snow with her gloved hand, hesitant. Then, what are we supposed to do? She finally whispered. The fear was a dull ache in my stomach that didn't subside. We tried to distract ourselves, tidying the cabin, stacking firewood, baking cookies, but every sound from the balcony or roof made my heart leap. The wind seemed to carry intention now, a hiss that felt almost alive. By evening, the sun had disappeared behind jagged peaks and darkness crept back into the chalet, magnifying every groan and creak. That night, around midnight, I woke to a scraping sound above us. My heart raced. It was subtle at first, like someone dragging a boot through powder, but then the loft hatch creaked under weight. Greta stirred beside me, whispering, "Did you hear that?" I nodded silently. We stayed frozen, barely breathing, until the noise faded. Sleep came fitfully, curled near the fireplace, haunted by dreams of the boot print circling endlessly, the exhaled breath trailing behind me. Morning came, revealing no footprints outside except ours, no evidence of intrusion, no trace of anyone having been there. But the loft hatch remained slightly ajar, dripping with melting snow. We left the chalet that day with a silent understanding. We had survived something inexplicable. Life slowly resumed its fragile normalcy, but the memory clung to me, a reminder that fear doesn't always need proof. It can exist purely as attention, awareness, and presence. And over the next weeks, the memory of the chalet haunted me. Every whisper of wind, every creak of snow underfoot reminded me of that night. I became hyper-aware, noticing things I had never cared about before. Shadowed corners, unusual sounds, and even footprints in the snow outside my own neighborhood. Greta and I texted constantly, sharing our unease, but we avoided talking about specifics. Fear felt contagious. It was easier to mention it in passing than face it fully together. Winter break ended and school resumed. Hallways were crowded and loud, yet I felt detached, carrying a fragile tension under my skin. Every time a door clicked, I flinched slightly. Every sudden noise made my pulse spike. It was a subtle shift in my perception of the world, an understanding that danger could exist unseen, that awareness was as critical as bravery. I realized the chalet had taught me something invaluable. Fear is a guide, and survival often comes from noticing details others overlook. One weekend, Greta invited me back to the chalet, this time with her parents present. I hesitated, but curiosity and the need for closure pushed me to accept. The chalet appeared smaller under daylight, its shadows sharper, corners more foreboding. We tried to treat it like any other cabin, baking, laughing awkwardly, and pretending nothing had happened. But by nightfall, when the wind rose and hissed along the balcony, my chest tightened. I understood immediately that the experience wasn't just a memory. It was alive in the air, lingering like frost on glass. We spent the night near the fireplace, watching the shadows, listening to every whisper of wind. Sleep remained elusive. I realized something important. Sometimes courage isn't about rushing forward. It's about patience, observation, and restraint. Survival wasn't in facing the presence directly, but in respecting it, staying aware and making cautious choices. By morning, I felt a quiet confidence, not triumph, but preparedness. Years have passed since that winter at Lake Lucerne, but the memory remains vivid. Greta and I drifted in some ways, but we shared a bond that only experience of terror could forge. I've traveled since then, climbed mountains and camped in remote locations, but I carry the lessons from that chalet like a map. I lock doors carefully, notice footprints, and trust my instincts in ways I never did before. I've realized that fear is not a weakness. It's a tool, a guide signaling danger, highlighting what requires attention. The chalet taught me that life is fragile, that vigilance is as important as courage, and that unknown forces, whether people or circumstances, deserve respect. Awareness, observation, and preparation often mean the difference between safety and disaster. I can still picture that single boot print in the snow, circling the chalet, a silent witness to our terror. The exhaled breath on the glass still sends a shiver down my spine when I remember it. And yet, the memory also carries a strange clarity, a lesson not just in fear, but in life itself. In the quiet, in the shadows, in the stillness of winter, we are reminded that attentiveness is strength, that we survive by noticing, and that courage often whispers rather than roars. The moral I carry from that experience is simple. Awareness and respect for the unknown are more powerful than reckless bravery. Fear teaches lessons if we listen. Complacency invites danger. Vigilance ensures survival. The chalet, the snow, the boot print. They became more than terror. They became a guide, a quiet mentor in understanding the balance between curiosity, caution, and courage. I never thought a simple invitation from an old school friend could unspool into something that gnawed at my sleep for years. But that's exactly what happened the summer I turned 19. Emery had always had a knack for the dramatic, a quality that had made him the center of our high school mischief. So, when he texted me late one evening, asking if I wanted to spend a midsummer night at his canal-side rental in Bruges, Belgium, I didn't hesitate. The city's reputation for cobblestone streets and quiet waterways was enough to lure me in, and I trusted Emery's sense of adventure, even if it occasionally veered toward reckless. The house itself was a charming brick building wedged along one of Bruges' narrower canals. Its facade was quaint, but it was the back of the house that truly caught the eye. The door opened directly onto the water, reflecting the moonlight like a silver ribbon. Emery, the twins, Nico and Rafe, and I set up sleeping bags in the long, wood-beamed living room, the occasional splash of a passing boat lending a rhythmic calm to the night. We joked and reminisced about school days, the kind of talk that makes you forget the world outside. Around 1 a.m, that illusion of calm shattered. The usual gentle lapping of the canal stopped abruptly. A single drip echoed across the room, startling me. I froze. It wasn't just the sound. It was the cadence, precise, almost deliberate. I told myself it was just a leaky pipe. But when I got up to check the kitchen, my heart skipped a beat. Wet footprints led across the tiled floor. They started at the back door, which I was certain I had locked. I traced them with my eyes, the cold dread crawling up my spine, and realized they disappeared toward the staircase. I called out, but the silence was thick. One by one, the others followed. Each step was slick under our bare feet, the air suddenly heavy with a damp, metallic scent. By the time we reached the second-floor landing, beneath a stained glass window that painted the walls with pale color, the footprints stopped. Then came the sound from the attic above, a soft knock, rhythmic, almost musical. A child's voice hummed a song in a language none of us recognized. Nico's whisper sliced the tension. The canal doors, are they still bolted? No one answered. The knocking turned into a slow drag, like something heavy sliding across the boards. We barricaded the landing and called the police, but when they arrived, the attic was empty. The glass was damp, as if pressed from within. Emery and I exchanged a glance neither of us would forget. The next day, the atmosphere felt off. Bruges remained picturesque, the canals shimmering under the morning sun, but our house felt alien, almost hostile. The landlord met us in the narrow courtyard and, in heavily accented English, assured us the attic had no outside access. The stained glass window faced the canal, 3 stories above the water. How then had whoever, or whatever, been up there entered? And why? We tried to rationalize. Maybe a stray animal had found a way in, or a prank left by a previous tenant. But the child's song echoed in my mind every time I closed my eyes. Its melody was haunting, and I remembered how it ended. A single drip, like a promise or a warning. That afternoon, we explored the surrounding canals, attempting to shake the lingering unease. Nico and Rafe laughed more freely than Emery and I, but even their bravado couldn't erase the chill lingering in the air. We debated whether to stay another night. Emery, ever the instigator, argued it would be cowardly to leave. "We'll never get the full story if we don't stay," he said, his grin a little too forced. By evening we returned, preparing for another night of restless sleep. The canals were quieter now, almost too quiet. I set up my sleeping bag near the window, hoping that proximity to the outside would make me feel safer. That's when I noticed it. The faintest trace of moisture on the wooden floor, leading yet again to the staircase. My stomach dropped. We confronted each other quietly, the words trembling on our lips. "It's happening again," I whispered. Emery's eyes were wide, his usual confidence gone. The twins didn't speak, simply exchanging a look that mirrored my own fear. We agreed to stay together, refusing to separate even for a moment, and then we waited. Around 1 a.m, the attic noises began once more. A knock, then a drag, followed by the soft, eerie lullaby of that child's voice. I could feel my pulse in my ears. None of us slept, none of us moved. We simply listened as the song wound its way into our consciousness, leaving a residue of unease we would never fully escape. The second night was worse. We tried to ignore the damp footprints, tried to convince ourselves it was an overactive imagination, but denial only made the tension sharper. I spent the evening near the window, listening to the canal, trying to draw strength from its lapping waters, but it was futile. Around midnight, the attic stirred again. That same knock, then the slow drag, and the child's song. It was softer this time, almost pleading. My chest tightened, every instinct screaming at me to leave, yet no one moved. We debated calling the police again, but it felt futile. They had come the previous night, seen nothing, and offered explanations that sounded hollow. Emery, desperate to reclaim control, suggested we try to confront whatever was up there. "It's probably someone squatting or an animal trapped," he said, though I noticed his voice quavered. Nico and Rafe exchanged uneasy glances, but none of us wanted to admit fear outright. We crept up the stairs, one after the other, flashlights cutting through the shadows. The attic door loomed ahead, a dark rectangle against the night. The smell of damp wood hit us first, followed by the faintest hint of something sweet like old candy. Then we heard it. The song, closer, almost inside our heads. Nico whispered, "I think it's in the attic." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I pushed the door open. The room was empty except for the puddles of water that glimmered in the flashlight's beam, forming odd, irregular patterns. The stained glass window, cracked now in one corner, glowed faintly with moonlight. And then I saw it. A small handprint pressed into the glass, wet and glistening. My stomach dropped. I stepped back, and the print vanished, as if evaporated by the night air. The song ended abruptly. The silence that followed was worse than any sound. We retreated, hearts pounding, the memory of the wet handprint etched in our minds. That night, sleep was impossible. I lay awake listening to every creak, every drip, imagining the attic door slowly opening. The others murmured in their sleep, but I was awake, consumed by a growing sense that we were not alone, and that something, or someone, had been observing us for hours. By morning, reality seemed fragile. The world outside continued its indifferent rhythm. Tourists wandering the cobbled streets, the smell of bread from nearby bakeries, the soft chug of canal boats. Yet the house retained its oppressive, otherworldly tension. We tried to laugh, tried to brush off the events, but our smiles felt thin, brittle. Emery insisted we investigate the attic more thoroughly during the day. Maybe we missed something. A loose floorboard, a hidden space, he said, though he no longer sounded convincing. I agreed reluctantly. With daylight, the room seemed almost ordinary. Dust motes in the air, beams of sunlight through the stained glass, the puddles dried. No prints, no traces of the night's horrors. We explored every corner. Finally, behind a loose panel in the far wall, we discovered an old trunk. It was locked, rusted shut, but inside we found scraps of paper, songs, writings in a language I couldn't decipher, sketches of canals and bridges. And among them, photographs. A small girl, long hair, eyes wide with fear, standing by the very canal behind the house. My blood ran cold. We stared at her faces, and I felt a profound sense of sadness, a haunting longing embedded in the images. That night, we made a pact. No one would go near the attic. Instead, we stayed together in the living room. The song returned, faintly at first, then more pronounced. But now I understood. It wasn't threatening. It was a plea. A lonely echo reaching through time, trying to be heard. And when the final drip fell that night, it no longer felt menacing. It felt like a goodbye. The remaining nights passed without incident. We left Bruges with unease still clinging to our minds, but also a quiet reverence for what we had glimpsed. Over time, the memory of the song softened, though it never fully vanished. I often thought about that girl, trapped in some past moment, reaching for attention or justice, leaving traces that could only be noticed by those willing to listen. Looking back, I realized the true terror wasn't in the attic, the song, or even the footprints. It was in the human tendency to ignore what is quietly asking to be acknowledged. Fear had made us hesitant, suspicious, and unkind to the unknown. Yet empathy, the willingness to listen, to respect, allowed us to understand it without harm. The moral became clear. Some mysteries exist not to frighten us, but to teach us the importance of attentiveness, compassion, and courage. In life, as in that canal house, ignoring subtle calls for help can leave us haunted, not by ghosts but by our own inattention. And so I learned to listen, to observe, and to act not out of fear, but out of understanding. The attic's secret never left me, and perhaps it never will, but neither did its quiet lesson in humanity. I've always believed that some summers leave marks on you that don't fade, and that particular weekend in Tuscany was one of them. I remember arriving at Rowan's villa on a hot Friday afternoon, the kind of sun that made the marble steps glisten and the olive groves sway as if whispering secrets. Rowan's parents had restored the villa to perfection, the kind of place where every stone and wooden beam seemed to hum with history. For 17-year-olds like us, it was paradise, a mix of luxury and adventure, untouched by the small worries of home. Rowan, Sophia, Marco, and I immediately settled into the routine of teenage freedom. We ran through the corridors like explorers, testing the echo of our laughter against the old stone walls, and found corners perfect for whispered secrets. Sophia had a habit of making everyone stop mid-step to admire the way the sunset hit the cypress trees in the distance, while Marco insisted on climbing every balcony railing to see if he could spot the abandoned farmhouses dotting the hills. I, as usual, trailed behind, camera in hand, capturing moments I already knew would haunt me in memory. The first night we decided on a movie marathon. Rowan's father, a tall man with kind eyes, had stocked the villa with films, popcorn, and chestnuts roasting in the kitchen hearth. There was something intoxicating about the smell, the sweet bitterness of chestnuts mixed with the lingering tang of olive oil. We laughed over ghost stories, some drawn from our own fears, some exaggerated from internet legends. It was all innocent fun until the clock passed midnight. Then it happened. The gunshot tore through the stillness of the villa. I remember thinking it was a firework at first, then realizing no firework could sound that metallic, that final. Marco rushed to the window and I followed, peering into the courtyard and seeing two dark silhouettes wrestling beneath the pale silver moon. Time slowed. Rowan's father appeared, staggering toward the front door, blood blooming across his chest like a macabre painting. My stomach dropped. The reality of violence, sharp, raw, and alive, smashed into the carefree bubble we'd built. We dove behind a wardrobe in Rowan's father's study, the old wood biting into our backs as we held our breath. Voices shouted in Italian, harsh and frantic, a language I couldn't understand but didn't need to. The intruders tore through the villa with the precision of people who had done this before. I could hear drawers opening, the shuffle of papers, a vase shattering somewhere down the hall. Then suddenly, the night fell silent again. A motorcycle's roar faded into the distance, leaving behind a tableau of chaos. Blood-stained terracotta tiles, overturned furniture, and the lingering smell of gunpowder. By dawn, the police arrived. Rowan's father was gone. The villa, once a sanctuary of laughter and warmth, felt violated and empty. None of us spoke much, our eyes tracing the familiar corridors as if expecting the intruders to reappear. For me, the image of masked faces wrestling in the moonlight, the metallic scent, and the weight of helplessness stayed with me. That night, a carefree sleepover became a nightmare that would follow me for years, shaping my thoughts on safety, trust, and the fragility of life. The morning after felt like walking through a painting that had been ruined. The villa, still dripping with the aftermath of violence, looked alive, yet hollow. Officers moved methodically, their Italian punctuated by questions and hand gestures I could only partially understand. Rowan's mother cried quietly, a sound that filled every corner of the grand kitchen where we had roasted chestnuts just hours before. The scent lingered, oddly comforting and horrifying at the same time, reminding me of the stark contrast between warmth and bloodshed. We were questioned separately. I remember the sharp eyes of a detective as he asked about the gunshot, about the shadows we saw, about anything that might lead him to the killers. I answered as truthfully as I could, though the words felt small compared to the enormity of the scene. Sophia's voice shook when she recounted seeing Rowan's father fall, and Marco's hands trembled as he gestured toward the broken window. Rowan, stoic on the outside, carried the quiet horror of a son who had lost a father in his own home. I had never felt more useless, more aware of how little control we have when chaos strikes. That day, the villa became a crime scene and a museum of fear. Every room held a memory now tinged with trauma. The library where the wardrobe had hidden us. The balcony where Marco had stood moments before the shooting. The kitchen where Sophia had tried to soothe Rowan's father with a damp cloth. Even the smallest details, like the flickering candlelight and the slight chill in the marble hallways, seemed amplified. My mind replayed every movement, every shadow, every sound, in an effort to make sense of something that made none. The funeral was quiet and heavy. I watched Rowan's mother stand by the gravesite, trying to hold herself together for her children. It was the first time I truly understood the permanence of death, and how sudden violence can unravel lives in a heartbeat. We returned to the villa only briefly after that, too afraid to confront what had happened, too respectful to disturb what remained. Over the following years, I avoided Italy in the summer. The olive groves, once a symbol of adventure and freedom, became reminders of fear. The laughter of my friends, once echoing through warm marble halls, became a ghost in my memory. And yet, the experience taught me something fundamental. The fragility of safety, the weight of presence, and the silent resilience required to move forward when life takes something from you that cannot be replaced. Even now, I sometimes close my eyes and see the moonlight on the olive trees, the silhouettes wrestling, the metallic flash of inevitability. That night marked me, and though I have learned to live with it, the lesson is clear. The world is both beautiful and perilous, and courage is not the absence of fear. It is acting despite it. It took months before any of us could speak about that night without our voices shaking. Rowan, Sophia, Marco, and I met occasionally in neutral spaces, careful to avoid the villa, careful to avoid triggering memories. But the silence had its own weight. One afternoon, nearly a year after the incident, Rowan suggested we return, not to stay, but to see the villa, to confront it, to try to reclaim some part of our summer. I hesitated. My gut screamed no, yet a small part of me needed closure. The villa looked different in daylight, less haunted but still scarred. The bloodstains had been scrubbed away, the shattered vases replaced, the wardrobe repaired. And yet, the marble floors seemed colder, the olive trees heavier, as though they remembered what had happened. Rowan led us through the halls quietly, pausing at each doorway as if measuring our reactions. Sophia clutched my arm and whispered how surreal it felt to be back, how the air smelled like history and fear combined. Marco, ever restless, ran to the balcony, peering over the hills, muttering something about how he'd never seen the shadows in the same way again. We eventually reached the study where we had hidden. I could still feel the pressure of the wardrobe against my back, the panic of holding my breath while the intruders moved through the rooms. It was unbearable for a moment, but Rowan placed a hand on my shoulder and said something that struck me. We survived it. That's more than anyone can say. The truth was hard but grounding. The villa wasn't just a place of horror, it was also a place where courage had been quietly forged. By sunset, we were silent, letting the wind move through the open windows, carrying the faint scent of chestnuts and olive oil. For the first time in a long while, I felt a tentative sense of peace. We left without looking back too long, knowing the villa would always hold the memory, but that memory no longer needed to control us. High school ended, and life pushed forward with relentless energy. Rowan went off to study art in Florence, Sophia pursued medicine, Marco got into engineering, and I stayed in our hometown, documenting life through photography. The villa, and that night, receded into the background of our lives, though never entirely. Sometimes, in photographs of olive groves or old stone houses, the past would intrude, a reminder that trauma is like a shadow. It follows, but it doesn't always define the present. Years later, I returned to Italy, this time with my camera and a deliberate intention, to photograph the countryside, the villas, the abandoned farmhouses. I wasn't looking to relive the past, but to understand it, to capture the balance between beauty and danger. Walking through the hills, I felt a connection to that night, the fear, the helplessness, but also the resilience that had grown quietly afterward. Life, I realized, was often about holding onto the light even when darkness intrudes. I even visited a few crime prevention seminars, sharing my experience with others, emphasizing awareness and preparedness without letting fear dominate life. It became a mission to turn a personal tragedy into something useful, something that could help others navigate unpredictability with caution and courage. Rowan eventually joined me for a few trips, and we laughed about the way Marco always ran to the balcony and Sophia always clung to my arm. The memory, once sharp and horrifying, became part of a shared history, a story we could finally tell without trembling. Looking back now, I understand that night as a turning point, not just for me, but for all of us. It forced us to confront mortality, to see the fragility of comfort, and to recognize the strength that arises in moments of terror. I learned to appreciate life's small details, the sunlight on the marble, the scent of roasted chestnuts, the sound of laughter in safe spaces, because they are fleeting, precious, and not guaranteed. I carry that lesson into everything I do. I have become more cautious, yes, but also more present. I don't take for granted the warmth of friends or the security of home. I have learned to honor memory without letting it paralyze me, to turn fear into awareness, and to act decisively when life demands it. And most importantly, I learned that courage isn't about never being afraid. It's about facing fear with resolve, even when the outcome is uncertain. The villa still stands, a silent witness to the events of that night. The olive trees sway in the breeze, indifferent to the pain and fear that once unfolded beneath their branches. I no longer avoid it. I visit quietly, paying respects to memory and life alike. Every step is deliberate, a small act of reclaiming space that violence once threatened to steal. In the end, the moral is clear. Life is unpredictable and sometimes cruel, but resilience, presence, and courage can transform trauma into wisdom. We can't control everything that happens to us, but we can control how we respond, how we remember, and how we grow. And sometimes, that is the most profound victory of all.